Now that we know about finding planets outside of our solar system, the next question to naturally ask is there life on any of these planets? This is not a new idea. People have been pondering this all the way back to ancient times. But it's been in the last few hundred years that people have really started to look around the universe, and as we learn more about it and learn how huge it is, it really seems to make sense that we're not alone. Giordano Bruno was he was kind of a loudmouth back in the late 1500s and was actually burned at the stake for being a heretic. And one of the heretical things that he said was that there's probably life on other worlds. He said that there is not merely one world, one earth, one sun, but as many worlds as we see bright lights around us. Remember that we have found lots and lots of planets. Some of them are larger than the Earth. Some of them are the same size as the Earth. Some of them are gaseous planets and some of them are solid planets. Could we find life on any of these or many of these? Well, because Earth-sized planets are relatively common, and we see that life on Earth has adapted well to the surface gravity of our planet, that's where a lot of people are looking. And this is the first time that we're really going to talk about this idea of sort of a Copernican doctrine part 2. You know, you hear people talking about, oh, you know, we learned that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that was really amazing, right? Well, we keep wanting to put Earth back at the center. When we started learning about the Milky Way galaxy, people started saying, oh, well, the sun's at the center, right? No, we're at the outskirts. And, you know, oh, we're the only planet with life. Well, hopefully not. And why should we just limit our discussion to life as we understand it on Earth? But since we don't really know what life elsewhere would be like, more on that later, it's probably easier to think about life similar to what we have on Earth, which means looking at planets similar to Earth. If we're trying to find, quote, habitable planets, and we're trying to keep our discussion sort of on life kind of as we know it, there's a natural way to define that. We define the so-called habitable zone or Goldilocks zone as an orbit that a planet would have around its sun where it's not too hot or not too cold, it's just right. And by that we mean where water can be in the liquid state. So a planet whose average temperature is between the freezing and boiling points of water. And the location of the Goldilocks zone depends upon the star. For our sun, Earth is in the habitable zone, Venus is too close, and Mars is just on the outer edge. If you have a hotter and brighter star, the habitable zone is going to be farther away. You've got to be farther away from that star. But if you've got a small, cool red dwarf star, the habitable zone has to be closer to the star. There are other considerations. For example, the greenhouse effect can make a planet warmer than you might expect for its distance. For example, remember I said that without the natural greenhouse effect, the average surface temperature of the Earth would be below freezing. And even though Venus is much hotter than the Earth because of its distance from the sun, it's the hottest planet overall because of its dense carbon dioxide atmosphere, giving it what we call a runaway greenhouse effect. Now, there's another thing you have to worry about as well. Stars put out harmful radiation. Our sun puts out X-rays and gamma rays, which are blocked by our upper atmosphere, thankfully. And our sun also puts out a whole lot of ultraviolet. And thankfully, our ozone layer blocks out not all, you have to wear your sunscreen, but a decent amount of that harmful ultraviolet. So when we look at planets, we're not just looking at the distance from the sun to get the temperature, we also have to look at the atmosphere of that planet and see not only is it a, quote, breathable atmosphere, but is the atmosphere protecting the surface of the planet, and is it making the surface of the planet a good temperature or a not so good temperature? We probably should define what life on Earth needs? And that way we can look at a planet and go, does it really have the right ingredients? Well, all life on Earth, as far as we know, or at least life that's not too weird, uses water as a basic solvent. So water is involved in all sorts of chemical reactions in our bodies. Life on Earth is carbon-based. Life on Earth requires energy of some sort. Some directly get energy from sunlight, like plants. Others get their energy through chemical reactions, like us. We eat our food, and there's that whole cycle you learned about in biology of how your food is turned into energy in your cells. And you have to reproduce. You have to pass on your genetic information. On Earth, we use RNA and DNA for all of our genetic functions, and we use proteins, which are encoded with these RNA and DNA, for doing various reactions in metabolism and growth and so forth. So if we're going to think about life elsewhere, we have to answer a series of questions. And we don't know the answer to these questions yet, and this is what makes it fascinating. Under what conditions can life on Earth actually exist? Under what conditions can life on Earth not exist? We keep finding critters in really bizarre, harsh places that you would not expect. So we don't even know the answer to this question on our own planet. Even if life is carbon-based and it uses water, does it have to use RNA and DNA? It has to use something like those, but does it specifically have to use those molecules? Does it even need to use water as its basic chemical solvent? Could other liquids be used as well? And does life even have to be carbon-based? On Earth, we get a little bit of a taste of this due to something called extremophiles. Extremophiles can live under really harsh conditions that would absolutely kill you and me. Extreme acidity, very hot, very cold, high pressure, low pressure, very dry, radiation. One of the most unkillable things on the planet are what we call tardigrades, or water bears, little tiny microscopic critters that are really, really hard to kill. Is it possible that there is silicon-based life forms? Well, science fiction writers have thought about it. This is from Star Trek, the original series, the good one. This is a creature called the Horta. This was a silicon-based life form. The jury is still out as to whether life could actually use silicon. Silicon is in the same column of the periodic table as carbon, which is why people say, well, if it doesn't use carbon, maybe it could use silicon. If alien life doesn't use DNA, it really is not going to be a problem. Well, first of all, Spock wouldn't exist because you couldn't mate humans and extraterrestrials. There's a whole ration of hurt there trying to figure out how that would happen anyways. But the point is that if life on another planet uses a different genetic system, it wouldn't even recognize our genetic system. So in science fiction, where you talk about, viruses from other worlds infecting the Earth, those viruses or bacteria or whatever the equivalent would be in extraterrestrial biology wouldn't probably even recognize our biology. So we probably really don't have to worry about cross-contamination. Definitely don't have to worry about interbreeding. And besides, life couldn't possibly exist in harsh interstellar space or interplanetary space. We don't have to worry about, life from another planet landing on Earth, let's say on a meteorite, and contaminating us. That only happens in science fiction. Probably not, but, as a scientist, I have to say, Remember those tardigrades, the water bears? They have survived being exposed to the cold vacuum and radiation of outer space. For this reason, in 1967, and many other reasons, an international treaty was developed. It's got a very long title. Basically, it's the Treaty on Being Nice to Outer Space, Not Polluting Outer Space, and Not Letting Outer Space Pollute Us. And Article 9 says that any country or private enterprise now, Elon Musk, that sends things into space has to do so to avoid the harmful contamination of space and the harmful contamination of the Earth. The first time we ever tested this is when we sent people to the moon. There was a nice little documentary that I saw on CNN a couple months ago where they showed how when the first astronauts come back from the moon, and the moon, like, zero chance of life there, right? They still put the poor astronauts in quarantine for a couple of weeks just in case they brought home some germs from the moon. This is why we try to clean as well as we can any spacecraft that have any chance of contaminating a habitable body. We scrub all things that we send to Mars, for example. Yeah, except for some reason, Israel sent a moon lander on the moon. That's great. Kudos for them for sending something to the moon. But somebody thought it was a good idea to put tardigrades on this one-way trip to the moon. And the craft sort of crashed, and it actually spilled tardigrades on the moon. We don't know what happened to the tardigrades. They're probably dead. Probably. Maybe. Sort of. Now, we've actually intentionally crashed some of our own spaceships because of this. Galileo was an unpersoned spacecraft that was sent to look at Jupiter up close. And it discovered that there was an ocean of water under the surface of the moon Europa. And we want to make sure that we didn't contaminate Europa. Eventually, the Galileo spacecraft was going to run out of fuel, and NASA wouldn't be able to steer it. And we didn't want Galileo to crash into Europa at some time in the distant future and contaminate it, so we intentionally crashed Galileo into Jupiter. So rest in peace, Galileo. You were a good little spacecraft. We did the same thing with Cassini. Cassini was an unpersoned spacecraft that orbited around Saturn and found that there were a number of moons around Saturn that also had liquid water oceans. So we also crashed Cassini into Saturn before it ran out of fuel, just to make sure we would never in the future accidentally pollute these beautiful, pristine, icy moons. What about the first time we sent people to Mars? We can't scrub germs from people. How are we going to protect Mars from human germs? The answer is, we really can't. And if there is life on Mars, how can we protect astronauts from it? Well, again, remember that the biology is probably very different. And so, our germs, their germs probably won't recognize each other. But can I be 100% sure of that? No. Turns out that some Earth bacteria, like our friend E. coli, have been shown to survive in Mars-like conditions. So NASA has to admit that you cannot scrub a spacecraft clean, totally clean. We might have already polluted Mars with all of our rovers. Now, cross-contamination would be easiest if we and so-called Martians share genetic material. And science fiction writers have thought about this idea of extraterrestrials from one planet planting the seeds of life on all other worlds so that creatures on different worlds actually come from a common genetic ancestor. And this is something called panspermia, all life, all seeding of all life in our galaxy. And the question would be, is it really ethical? I mean, it's probably illegal because it violates the International Space Treaty, right? We're not supposed to contaminate outer space. And intentionally planting DNA on other worlds, that's pretty contaminating as far as I'm concerned. So could life have evolved elsewhere and been brought to Earth through meteorites or some other means? We don't know. This is highly speculative, but it's something that people have thought about.